"You don't belong in this building." The words cracked across the marble lobby so sharply that conversation stopped mid-sentence, and even the sound of rolling luggage near the glass entrance seemed to disappear for a moment. Elijah Brooks stumbled half a step as two security guards tightened their grip on his arms, pulling him across the polished floor beneath the towering silver logo of Reed and Vale Corporation. Rainwater dripped from the hem of his faded charcoal coat, leaving dark streaks behind him like footprints nobody wanted to claim. Around them, employees froze beside glowing elevator panels and marble columns wrapped in gold trim. A woman holding an iced coffee lowered her phone slowly. A junior analyst standing near the reception desk glanced away, pretending not to stare, but his eyes kept drifting back toward the tall black man being escorted toward the revolving doors. Elijah did not resist. That was the strange part. His face remained calm despite the humiliation unfolding under the cold white lobby lights. One of the guards pushed the call button to unlock the exit gates while the other muttered under his breath about trespassers and homeless men wandering into executive properties during Investor Week. Elijah adjusted his glasses quietly after they slipped down his nose. His dark eyes moved across the lobby, not with anger, but with something heavier. Disappointment. Above him, giant crystal fixtures reflected against the black marble ceiling while a digital screen displayed the company's slogan in glowing silver letters. "Building the future with integrity." Elijah stared at those words for one long second, and something in his expression shifted, almost like grief. At the far end of the lobby, Nathaniel Reed stepped out of a private elevator surrounded by assistants in tailored navy suits. Young, polished, and perfectly composed, the vice president carried himself like the entire $40 billion company rested on his shoulders alone. His sharp jaw tightened the instant he noticed the scene unfolding near the doors. "What's going on?" he asked, voice clipped and cold. The head of security straightened immediately. "Unauthorized individual on. Executive level access, sir. Claims he belongs here." A few employees laughed softly under their breath. Nathaniel's gaze swept over Elijah from head to toe, taking in the worn boots, the weathered coat, the water dripping onto the marble floor. His expression hardened instantly. "Get him outside before the Tokyo investors arrive," he said. "Now." The guards obeyed without hesitation. One reached for Elijah's shoulder more firmly this time, steering him toward the revolving doors as rain lashed the glass beyond them. Elijah finally spoke, his deep voice calm enough to cut through the tension without rising above it. "I helped build this company before that logo was even printed on the wall." The sentence landed strangely in the air. A receptionist blinked. Someone near the elevators exchanged an uncertain glance with another employee. Nathaniel let out a quiet laugh, humorless and sharp. "Everybody says that when they want attention," he replied. Then the lobby exploded with the sound of running footsteps. A man burst from the stairwell on the mezzanine level, breathless, face pale with panic. "Stop," he screamed so loudly the entire lobby turned toward him. His tie hung loose around his collar as he pointed directly at Elijah with a trembling hand. "Don't touch him. That's the owner." The lobby remained frozen even after the vice president from corporate strategy pushed through the crowd, chest heaving as if he had sprinted down 30 flights of stairs without stopping. Rain hammered against the glass walls overlooking downtown Chicago while employees stared between Elijah Brooks and the terrified executive now standing beside him. Nobody spoke. Nobody even moved. The only sound came from the soft hum of elevator cables somewhere high above the building. Nathaniel Reed felt the blood drain slowly from his face. "Owner," he repeated quietly, almost unable to force the word out. The executive swallowed hard and nodded immediately. "Elijah Brooks," he said breathlessly. "Original founder. Majority shareholder. Board control holder." The words landed one after another like stones dropping into still water. Several employees near the reception desk exchanged stunned looks. One security guard loosened his grip on Elijah's arm so quickly it almost looked painful. The other stepped back entirely. Nathaniel stared at Elijah again, but this time the worn coat and old boots no longer looked ordinary. They looked intentional. Elijah adjusted his glasses calmly and glanced toward the massive silver logo stretching across the marble wall. For a long moment he said nothing. The silence itself seemed to shrink the entire lobby. 11 years earlier, Elijah Brooks had disappeared from public life after the fire at the South River manufacturing plant. Every business magazine in America had covered the story. 3 workers trapped beneath collapsing steel beams. One founder who ran back inside while executives evacuated through the front entrance. Elijah survived, but barely. Burns across his shoulders. Months in recovery. Then years away from cameras, boardrooms, and interviews. Over time the company changed. Executives retired. Investors reshaped leadership. New employees arrived who knew the founder only through framed photographs hanging near the executive floor conference rooms. Most assumed he was dead or permanently retired. Nathaniel Reed had never met him once. He had joined Reed and Vale 7 years earlier, fresh out of Harvard Business School, with sharp suits, polished confidence, and an obsession with control. Under his leadership, profits climbed higher than ever before. Employee satisfaction fell quietly in the background, but investors did not care about that. Nathaniel believed appearance created authority. Expensive watches. Perfect lobbies. Carefully selected clients. He often reminded managers that image protected billion-dollar companies more effectively than kindness ever could. And now the man standing under the bright lobby lights, rainwater dripping onto marble floors, was the very person whose vision had built the corporation from a rented warehouse on the South Side decades earlier. Elijah looked toward the young receptionist whose nervous hand still hovered above her keyboard. "You can relax," he said softly. "Nobody here knew." His voice carried no anger, which somehow made the humiliation hanging over the lobby feel even heavier. Nathaniel opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Behind him, several assistants lowered their eyes toward the floor. One in turn slowly turned off the phone she had secretly been using to record the confrontation. Outside, thunder rolled across the city skyline while traffic lights reflected red and gold through the rain-soaked streets below. Elijah reached down and picked up his cracked phone from the marble floor. The screen flickered weakly beneath the lobby lights. He slipped it carefully into his coat pocket before finally meeting Nathaniel's eyes. "This building used to feel warmer," he said quietly. "Now everybody looks afraid to breathe." No one in the lobby seemed to remember how to move after Elijah Brooks spoke those words. Employees stood frozen beside glowing elevator panels while rain continued sliding down the 40-foot glass walls overlooking downtown Chicago. Somewhere near the reception desk, an ice machine hummed softly behind the executive coffee bar, absurdly normal against the crushing silence hanging in the room. Nathaniel Reed swallowed hard and loosened his tie for the first time all morning. The perfectly controlled image he carried like armor suddenly felt too tight around his chest. Elijah remained near the revolving doors, calm and unreadable beneath the cold white lights reflecting across the marble floor. Water dripped slowly from the edge of his coat sleeve, forming tiny silver pools near his worn boots. He glanced around the lobby with quiet familiarity, as though every polished surface carried a memory no one else could see. "Sir," the executive from corporate strategy said carefully, stepping closer. "The board has been trying to reach you for 3 hours." Elijah nodded once. "I know." His voice stayed low, but every employee strained to hear him now. Nathaniel finally found enough breath to speak. "Mr. Brooks," he began carefully, "there has clearly been a misunderstanding." Elijah looked at him for several long seconds before answering. "A misunderstanding happens once," he said quietly. "Culture happens every day." The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. Several assistants lowered their eyes immediately. Nathaniel felt heat rise into his neck. For years he had believed discipline built successful companies. Strong image. Tight control. Perfect presentation. Weakness, emotion, and disorder had no place in corporate leadership as far as he was concerned. Yet standing there now, facing the founder himself, Nathaniel suddenly saw the lobby differently through Elijah's silence. Nobody smiled. Nobody relaxed. Even breathing inside the building seemed measured and cautious. Elijah slowly turned toward the massive digital screen hanging above reception. Quarterly profits flashed across it beside glossy advertisements featuring smiling executives and polished conference rooms flooded with artificial sunlight. "That screen used to display employee birthdays," Elijah said softly. A receptionist blinked in surprise. "Excuse me, sir." Elijah pointed toward the display without looking away from it. "Back when we started the company, we could not afford fancy branding campaigns. But every Friday we put workers' birthdays on the monitor because people matter more when they feel seen." Nathaniel stared at the screen as if noticing it for the first time. The company's slogan beneath the profit numbers suddenly looked sterile and hollow. A memory surfaced unexpectedly in Elijah's mind then, sharp and vivid against the polished coldness surrounding him now. 26 years earlier, the first Reed and Vale office had been nothing more than a cramped warehouse with broken heaters and folding chairs bought secondhand from a church auction. Elijah remembered staying overnight beside exhausted workers eating $5 takeout while snow piled outside the loading dock doors. Nobody wore $1,000 suits back then. Nobody cared about status. They cared about surviving together. Building together. Across the lobby, one of the younger interns slowly approached carrying a small paper cup. Her hands trembled slightly as she offered it to Elijah. "Coffee, sir," she whispered. Elijah accepted it gently. "Thank you." The warmth of the cup settled against his cold fingers while the smell of roasted coffee drifted into the marble silence. Nathaniel watched the exchange carefully. The intern looked relieved simply because Elijah had spoken kindly to her. That realization hit Nathaniel harder than the public humiliation itself. Before he could speak again, the private elevator chimed softly behind him. The board members had arrived. Expensive shoes clicked rapidly across the marble floor as several gray-haired executives hurried toward Elijah with visible panic in their faces. And for the first time since becoming vice president, Nathaniel Reed felt truly small inside his own building. The board members moved toward Elijah Brooks with the kind of urgency usually reserved for financial disasters or national emergencies. Expensive Italian shoes struck the marble floor in uneven rhythm while assistants scrambled to open tablets and silence ringing phones. Nathaniel Reed stepped aside automatically, though only minutes earlier he had controlled every inch of the lobby like a king surveying his territory. Now the entire building seemed to bend around Elijah instead. Richard Vale, silver-haired and breathing hard despite the short walk from the executive elevator, reached Elijah first. "Elijah," he said quietly, extending a trembling hand. "We have been trying to contact you all morning." Elijah shook his hand politely but without warmth. "I know," he replied. Richard glanced nervously toward the employees still gathered near reception. "Perhaps we should continue this upstairs." Elijah looked around the lobby one more time before answering. His eyes lingered briefly on the security guards now standing stiff and silent near the revolving doors. "No," he said softly. "I think this is exactly where the conversation should happen." A nervous silence followed immediately. Nathaniel felt every pair of eyes drifting toward him without anyone needing to say his name aloud. The cold air from the overhead vents suddenly felt sharper against his skin. Across the lobby, rain streaked down the giant windows in silver lines while downtown traffic crawled through the wet Chicago streets below. Elijah slowly removed his damp coat and folded it neatly over one arm. Beneath it he wore a simple navy sweater with no logo, no expensive branding. Nothing designed to impress anyone. Somehow that simplicity now carried more authority than every tailored suit standing around him. "Do you know what the first rule of this company used to be?" Elijah asked quietly. Nobody answered. Even the receptionist stopped typing. Elijah looked toward the giant slogan glowing above the lobby. Before profits. Before expansion. Before investor relations. His voice remained calm, but every word landed with unsettling clarity. We built this company on one idea. Every person who walks through these doors deserves dignity. Nathaniel lowered his eyes for a moment. He remembered saying almost the opposite during a management seminar 6 months earlier. Appearance affects value. Perception shapes trust. Eliminate discomfort before it reaches investors. At the time the room had applauded him. Now those same philosophies sounded hollow inside the heavy silence surrounding the lobby. Richard Vail cleared his throat carefully. Elijah, perhaps this situation can be resolved privately. Elijah finally turned toward Nathaniel directly. The younger executive straightened instinctively beneath that calm gaze. What is your name again? Elijah asked. Nathaniel Reed, sir. Elijah nodded once. Your father worked nights in our Detroit warehouse during the winter of 1998. Nathaniel blinked in surprise. You remember that? I remember everybody who helped build this place. Elijah's voice softened slightly. Your father used to bring extra gloves for workers who could not afford them. Nathaniel felt his chest tighten unexpectedly. He had not heard anyone mention his father in years. The old man died before Nathaniel graduated college, long before the promotions, the penthouse condo, and the expensive suits replaced every trace of where he came from. Elijah glanced around the lobby again. Your father believed people mattered more than appearances. Nathaniel could not answer. Nearby, one of the interns quietly wiped tears from her eyes before pretending to adjust papers on her clipboard. The atmosphere inside the building had shifted completely now. The lobby no longer felt like a polished corporate machine. It felt exposed. Human. Uncomfortable in a way no financial report could hide. Elijah picked up the cracked phone from his coat pocket and looked briefly at the shattered screen. I came back because I wanted to see what this company had become without me, he said softly. Then he looked directly at Nathaniel again. I just did. The lobby stayed silent long after Elijah Brooks finished speaking. Nobody reached for a phone. Nobody whispered anymore. Even the giant digital stock ticker wrapping around the upper walls felt strangely muted beneath the heavy stillness hanging over the building. Nathaniel Reed stood motionless near the reception desk while memories he had buried beneath years of ambition slowly resurfaced one by one. His father coming home exhausted from warehouse shifts with cracked hands smelling faintly of engine oil and cold air. His father teaching him to shake every janitor's hand because dignity mattered. His father once saying, never let success make you blind to people. Nathaniel had not thought about those words in years. Somewhere along the climb upward, he had replaced them with quarterly projections, investor optics, and polished executive language. Elijah glanced toward the revolving doors where rain still streamed down the glass in silver ribbons. Outside, headlights reflected across wet Chicago streets while thunder rolled softly above the skyline. Do you know what I noticed first when I walked in today? Elijah asked quietly. Richard Vail shifted uneasily beside him. The silence, Elijah continued before anyone answered. Not peaceful silence. Fearful silence. Several employees lowered their heads immediately. One assistant quietly pressed her lips together as though holding back emotion she did not fully understand. Elijah looked around the lobby again, taking in the marble floors, the expensive lighting, the perfectly pressed uniforms worn by security. People used to laugh in this building, he said softly. Now everybody looks like they are waiting to be punished for breathing wrong. Nathaniel felt every word settling into his chest heavier than the last. Because deep down, he knew Elijah was right. Over the years he had created systems designed to eliminate mistakes, but somewhere inside that process, kindness disappeared too. Employees stopped speaking freely. Managers became afraid of losing positions. Human resources turned into damage control instead of support. The building became beautiful on the outside and cold everywhere else. Richard cleared his throat nervously. Elijah, the Tokyo investors are arriving in less than 20 minutes. Perhaps we should move this discussion upstairs before rumors spread through the company. Elijah smiled faintly, though there was sadness in it. The problem is not rumors, Richard. He gestured calmly toward the employees surrounding them. The problem is that everyone here already knows the truth. Near the elevators, one of the younger security guards slowly removed his earpiece. His face carried visible shame. "Sir," he said quietly toward Elijah, "I am sorry for how we treated you." Elijah turned toward him gently. "What is your name?" "Marcus, sir." Elijah nodded once. "You were doing what you were trained to do, Marcus." Then his eyes drifted toward Nathaniel. "That is what worries me." The words landed like ice water through the lobby. Nathaniel finally stepped forward, his expensive shoes echoing sharply against the marble floor. "Mr. Brooks," he said carefully, voice lower now, stripped of its usual authority, "I made assumptions about you." Elijah held his gaze calmly. "No," he replied softly. "You made assumptions about who belongs in places like this." Nathaniel opened his mouth but nothing came out. Around them, employees stood completely still beneath the cold glow of chandelier light reflecting across polished stone. The lobby suddenly felt less like a corporate headquarters and more like a courtroom without a judge. Elijah slipped his cracked phone back into his coat pocket and exhaled slowly. "When people stop feeling seen," he said quietly, "they stop caring about the place they work. And when that happens, no amount of money can save a company." Somewhere behind the reception desk, a coffee cup slipped from someone's trembling hand and shattered softly against the marble floor. Nobody moved to clean it up. Nobody even looked away from Elijah Brooks. For several long seconds after the coffee cup shattered against the marble floor, nobody moved. Tiny streams of dark coffee spread slowly between polished tiles while broken ceramic reflected the chandelier light overhead like scattered pieces of glass. The silence inside the lobby no longer felt tense. It felt exposed. Honest in a way the building had probably not felt in years. Elijah Brooks stood quietly near the revolving doors with rainwater still clinging to the shoulders of his navy sweater. Outside, downtown Chicago disappeared behind gray sheets of rain and fog rolling between skyscrapers. The city looked blurred and distant through the giant lobby windows, almost dreamlike beneath the storm clouds pressing low across the skyline. Nathaniel Reed finally looked away from Elijah for the first time since the confrontation began. His eyes drifted toward the reflection staring back at him in the polished marble wall. Expensive suit. Silver cuff links. Perfectly styled hair. Everything carefully constructed over years of corporate survival. Yet standing there now, he suddenly looked exhausted to himself. Older somehow. One of the janitorial staff quietly approached with a mop cart, clearly unsure whether to clean the spilled coffee or leave the scene untouched. Elijah noticed the hesitation immediately. "It is okay," he said gently. "You can clean it." The older woman nodded nervously and knelt beside the broken cup. Nathaniel watched Elijah carefully. Most executives never noticed workers like her. They walked past cleaning crews every day without seeing faces, names, or tired eyes. But Elijah stepped slightly aside to give her room, holding the revolving door steady so cold wind would not blow rainwater toward her supplies. Such a small gesture. Yet several employees noticed it instantly. The older woman glanced up at Elijah before quietly speaking. "Thank you, sir." Elijah smiled faintly. "My mother cleaned office buildings for 20 years, he replied softly. "I know those mop buckets get heavier near the end of a shift." The woman blinked quickly and lowered her eyes as emotion crossed her face. Nathaniel felt something tighten. Painfully inside his chest again. He had spent years trying to command respect through authority, but Elijah seemed to create dignity around people without even trying. Richard Vale checked his watch anxiously. "The investors are waiting upstairs," he whispered carefully. Elijah nodded once but remained still. His attention drifted toward the massive founder portrait hanging above the executive elevator entrance. The photograph showed him decades younger standing beside factory workers wearing denim jackets and dusty work boots. Everybody in the photo looked tired. Everybody also looked proud. Elijah stared at the image quietly. "We took that picture after the first winter we survived without layoffs," he said softly. "Nobody thought we would make it." Nathaniel followed his gaze upward. He had passed that portrait thousands of times without ever asking about the people standing beside the founder. To him it had simply been decoration. Corporate history polished into branding. But now the faces inside the frame suddenly felt real. Human beings instead of symbols. The rain outside softened gradually, changing from hard streaks against the glass into slower drifting drops. The city lights beyond the windows began glowing warmer beneath the storm clouds. Somewhere high above them, thunder faded into distant silence. Elijah exhaled slowly as though carrying the weight of years inside his chest. "You know the strange thing?" he asked quietly without looking away from the old photograph. "This company became richer after I left." His eyes lowered toward the employees standing around the lobby. But it stopped feeling alive. Nobody answered him. Nobody could. Because every person standing there suddenly understood the same uncomfortable truth. A building could shine like gold and still feel empty inside. And for the first time since Nathaniel Reed entered the corporate world, he realized success and humanity were not supposed to be enemies. The lobby remained wrapped in silence even after the rain outside finally began to ease. Water slid slowly down the massive windows overlooking downtown Chicago while the late afternoon light softened from cold gray into muted gold. Employees still stood scattered across the marble floor, nobody fully returning to work, nobody willing to leave the strange gravity surrounding Elijah Brooks. Richard Vail adjusted his glasses nervously and glanced once more toward the executive elevators. "The investors are becoming concerned," he whispered carefully. Elijah looked at him calmly. "Then let them wait a few more minutes." The authority in his voice was quiet but absolute. Nobody questioned him. Near the reception desk, Nathaniel Reed stood with both hands clasped tightly behind his back, staring at the founder portrait hanging above the elevators. For years he had walked beneath that photograph believing leadership meant distance, control, and perfection. Yet the man in the portrait beside factory workers and warehouse crews looked nothing like the version of power Nathaniel had spent his career chasing. Elijah slowly walked across the lobby then, his worn boots echoing softly against polished marble. Employees instinctively stepped aside to clear a path, though not from fear anymore. Respect moved through the room now like something alive. He stopped beside the reception counter and ran his fingers gently across the edge of the dark wood surface. "This used to be a help desk," he said quietly. One receptionist looked confused. Elijah smiled faintly. "Not for customers. For employees." Nathaniel frowned slightly. "Employees?" Elijah nodded. "If somebody could not afford daycare for a week, they came here. If somebody lost family, they came here. If somebody needed rent assistance after medical bills, this company stepped in quietly." Several employees exchanged stunned glances. Nobody had ever heard those stories before. Elijah looked toward the towering lobby ceiling. "We were never supposed to become just another corporation." The word settled deeply into the room. Nathaniel suddenly remembered an old interview he once watched during business school. A younger Elijah Brooks standing in front of a warehouse loading dock saying, "Companies survive through profits. But they matter through people." At the time Nathaniel dismissed it as sentimental leadership language. Now he understood he had misunderstood the entire foundation of the company itself. One of the board members stepped closer carefully. "Elijah," he said in a low voice, "the investors are expecting your approval on the expansion deal." Elijah turned slowly. "The overseas outsourcing proposal?" The board member nodded once. Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly for the first time all afternoon. How many American warehouse jobs disappear if we sign it? The board member hesitated. Approximately 1,800 over 2 years. The lobby fell silent again. Nathaniel felt his stomach tighten immediately. He had approved the proposal himself 3 weeks earlier because analysts projected higher margins and stronger investor confidence. Numbers. Efficiency. Growth. Elijah looked directly at him. Did you ever visit the warehouses before approving those layoffs? Nathaniel opened his mouth, then stopped. Because the answer was no. He had reviewed charts, forecasts, and presentations inside glass conference rooms high above the city. But he had never walked through the loading docks. Never shaken the hands of workers who would lose careers built over decades. Elijah nodded slowly as though the silence itself answered everything. That is the problem, he said softly. People become easy to erase when you never bother learning their names. Nathaniel lowered his eyes toward the marble floor. Around them, employees stood completely still beneath the fading chandelier light while the last traces of rain rolled quietly down the windows. Then Elijah reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it calmly to Richard Vail. Richard unfolded it with trembling fingers. His face immediately turned pale. You are canceling the expansion deal, he whispered. Elijah nodded once. And effective immediately, he said quietly, I am returning as active chairman of this company. Warm evening light slowly replaced the cold storm shadows inside the marble lobby as employees stood silently around Elijah Brooks and Nathaniel Reed. Nobody reached for phones anymore. Nobody whispered. The entire building felt suspended in a strange stillness beneath the towering founder portrait. Above the executive elevators. Nathaniel lowered his eyes toward the polished floor, the reflection of chandelier light trembling faintly across his expensive shoes. For the first time in years, he no longer looked like a man in control. Elijah stood calmly near the reception desk with his dark wool coat folded over one arm, his cracked phone still resting in his pocket. The older board members remained nearby, silent and uneasy, watching the confrontation unfold without interruption. Nathaniel finally looked up. I thought success meant protecting the company from weakness, he admitted quietly. Elijah studied him for a long moment before answering. And somewhere along the way, he said softly, you started treating people like weaknesses instead of human beings. The words settled heavily into the lobby. Near the entrance, Marcus stood beside the revolving doors with lowered eyes while several receptionists quietly listened from behind glowing computer screens. Outside, the rain had nearly stopped completely, leaving soft silver reflections across the Chicago streets below the skyscraper windows. Nathaniel swallowed hard. I judged you the moment I saw you walk in. Elijah nodded once. Because of my clothes. Nathaniel hesitated before speaking again. Because I decided somebody who looked like you could not belong here. Silence followed immediately. Honest silence. The kind nobody could escape from. Elijah reached into his coat pocket and removed the old silver employee badge worn smooth by time. He placed it gently into Nathaniel's hand. Your father understood this company better than you do, Elijah said quietly. Nathaniel stared down at the badge while emotion tightened across his face. Elijah turned toward the glowing lobby windows one final time. I did not come back for revenge, he said softly. I came back because this place forgot how to see people. The next morning, soft sunlight poured through the towering glass walls of Reed and Vail Corporation, washing the marble lobby in warm gold instead of the cold white reflections that had filled the building the day before. Employees entered quietly through the revolving doors carrying coffee cups and laptops, but something in the atmosphere had changed. People no longer rushed past each other with lowered eyes. Receptionists smiled softly while greeting workers by name. Even the security desk near the entrance felt calmer beneath the gentle morning light stretching across the polished floor. Above the reception area, the giant digital screen no longer displayed stock numbers or investor headlines. Instead, employee birthdays and community programs scrolled slowly beside photographs of warehouse teams and maintenance crews. Near the elevator entrance, Marcus stood straighter in his uniform while helping an older janitor carry cleaning supplies through the lobby. Nobody told him to do it. He simply did. At exactly 8:30, the executive elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Elijah Brooks stepped into the lobby wearing the same dark wool coat and navy sweater, calm as ever beneath the golden morning light. Conversations quieted naturally as employees looked toward him, not with fear, but respect. A few people nodded politely. Elijah nodded back. Near the founder portrait, Nathaniel Reed waited silently with the old silver employee badge resting in his hand. His expensive suit remained perfectly pressed, but something in his posture had softened overnight. He no longer carried himself like a man trying to dominate every room he entered. Elijah stopped beside him beneath the giant portrait hanging over the marble lobby. For a moment neither man spoke. Sunlight reflected across the polished floor while the city slowly awakened beyond the skyscraper windows. Nathaniel looked down at the worn badge before carefully handing it back. "I think I understand now," he said quietly. Elijah studied him calmly. "Understanding is easy," he replied softly. "Living differently is the hard part." Nathaniel nodded once. No excuses. No defense. Just honesty. Around them, employees continued moving through the building beneath the warm morning light, and for the first time in years, the company no longer felt cold.